Good evening. We're going to start this plenary titled Opportunities and Challenges for an Engaged STS. My name is Kim Fortune, and I will be incoming president of the society, and I can't think of a better way to do so than with this panel. I want to thank Heather Paxson for conceiving it and curating it and inviting a really wonderful slate of panelists. The session was conceived to put before us as a community many different ways of engaging STS and many different contexts in which that engagement is called for. So there's a diversity of approaches that we'll discuss. Okay, so I'll first introduce our panelists quickly. There's fuller bios in your program. We'll have Benjamin from Princeton, Shen Qing from Hsin University in Taiwan, Hugh Gustafson from George Washington University, Sheila Jasanoff from Harvard, Tanya Prados Bustos from National University of Columbia, and Nick Shapiro from the Chemical Heritage Foundation. Thanks to all of you for joining us. So they have been asked to consider responses to 5 questions, and we'll do the first 2 kind of to lay the landscape and then open it for discussion among the panelists. And the first 2 are, how do you characterize the political context, discursive field, or problem space in which you work, and why it calls for an engaged STS? And then the second is, what forms of STS engagement have you been involved in, and what have been key successes? So this is our first question. Ruha? Yes.
Right, so we were each asked to provide an image that would encapsulate in some ways our response to each of the first 2 questions. Before I share with you my very brief response, and we were told to keep it to 1 to 2 minutes, but I'm not sure how that's going to work. I just want to thank the organizers and just say that this is one of those sessions where you're asked to speak when you really feel like you should be in the back taking notes. Just looking over the program for the conference this year, I'm really stunned by the many, many sessions that, in my mind, at least according to the titles, exemplify what we're here to talk about. So I don't think in any way any of us feel like we have it figured out, or that our efforts are really are the great illustrations of this. I've seen it and been torn in terms of the choices to make at each time period. So with that said, the way that I would very succinctly characterize the problem space or the discursive space in which I think I'm trying to work, and where I think an engaged approach to STS is valuable, is a critical race approach to STS, or critical race STS. And this problem space builds upon feminist STS, decolonial STS, and all the many normative, explicitly normative and political approaches to STS. So it's building and in conversation with these other neighboring approaches. And 3 things I'll just highlight as I think as constitutive to a critical race STS. One is that we're investigating the racial logics and structures that are embedded in technoscience. We're thinking about race itself as a kind of social technology that does things in the world, creates in some ways parallel universes. And so we want to think about social technologies as one of many technologies that we want to problematize and investigate. And thirdly, we're thinking about how technoscience is appropriated, reimagined, and resisted by oppressed people. So not simply race and racialized groups as the object of analysis, but as the subjects and protagonists and knowledge constructors. And so we want to think critically and imaginatively about how this is already happening and how we can use our work to create more space, both within institutions and outside of traditional institutions, to allow critical race approaches to STS to proliferate not simply among scholars, but among all types of collaborators. So there's a backstory to why I started to think about this as a problem space that I won't get into because I've now gone over my minute. I hopefully will circle back around and I'll be able to elaborate a little more on how I'm thinking about this.
Hi, I'm Xin Chen, well, French call me Digo, friends and family. I'm from Taiwan, so, well, the images, I know artistically is terrible, it's a collage. But basically that's where I come from. Well, it's during the Cold War era, you know, every American client states such as Taiwan, South Korea, and maybe some other states, you have this kind of structure. You have a dictator up there, and in our case, it's father Chiang Kai-shek and his son, and both are great leaders. And then they have trust, and usually the secret police, but it can be military, it can be gangsters. So if you are political descent, you are suspected of sympathizing with communism or whatever, you got locked up, your family got murdered, and all this kind of thing happen. That's one side. But on the other side, usually these kind of states got a set of technocrats. They are usually educated in the US or UK, and they usually get an engineering degree, a physics degree or whatever. And they work alongside USAID or others. And so in Orthodox historiography in Taiwan, in many other states, usually the thugs are the bad guys. Democracy get rid of them. And technocrats, they are the good guys. They make our country rich. And so then that's the second picture. Okay. So this is a response of our people back in the 1980s when I was a student activist toward that kind of economic development and technocracy. They bring it up. It's a single word, a single character in Chinese character, Yue. It's actually a copy from the Minamata campaign in Japan back in 1968. It was a Japanese artist, Japanese documentary maker who come out with this idea. You don't need a lot of slogan. You only need one character. And on in Japanese, yuan in Chinese. It can mean resent, sadness, hate, loss of love, whatever. And this character came out in Taiwan back in 1987, so this year we are celebrating the 30th anniversary. It was in reaction to a planned investment project of DuPont Chemical in Lugang in Taiwan, a titanium dioxide plant. And it was the first successful protest that really holded the project. Yeah, so I grew up in this kind of atmosphere that that kind of science and technology, you really don't think that you can separate them from the kind of state violence that's going on.
We have one more.
I think this one is me, so.
So you need to move on.
Yes, so thank you to Heather and Kim for inviting me. When they did invite me, I had the impression they had come to the wrong address because unlike my friends and neighbors to the right of me, I don't see myself as an activist. And in a way, I picked a picture which explicitly contrasted with yours because I had the benefit of seeing yours first, and I wanted to illustrate the extremely unglamorous setting in which I do my work. But then I thought to myself, well, it's struggle, even if not activism, and maybe it's worth calling attention to what struggle looks like when you're actually part of that technocracy that's supposed to be making the world wealthy. And it's, of course, not just engineers, but also policy makers or engineers of society. And Ruha already mentioned that social technologies are as much part of our domain of study as any other kind of materiality. So, quite a number of years ago, I think even before I came to Harvard, I had decided that the only kind of institution that I had a prayer of changing with my kinds of skills was the kind that's represented in that image, academic institutions. And I hadn't realized to what extent that's actually the hardest kind of institution to change. And there was some kind of statistic not long ago about institutions that had survived 700 years or more, and some healthy percentage, like 20% of them, turned out to be academic institutions, and it's not for nothing. I mean, they're thoroughly deeply embedded, they do not change their ways, and they do not like being shaken, and they continue to produce those very same technocrats who then in turn produce the Minamotos of the world and so forth. So that, I think it's also quite appropriate that at this 4S meeting, I should have been one of the recipients of infrastructure recognition, because we are a field that calls attention to the importance of the unglamorous. So I will just, as my introductory comment, just state and restate that the work of working away in places where you don't expect resistance to be entrenched, the work to be every bit as much struggle as when it is against a dictator, except the dictator is highly beneficent and wishes to nudge you all the time. That in those settings, nevertheless, there is a kind of conceptual activism, and we'll circle around to some of the details later.
No. Mine is.
They're seeing your slide.
You have to go behind. Another one?
Back one.
Back one? Another one. One.
Yes. We're trying to coordinate what they see and what you see.
It's different on the big screen.
No, now it is okay. Well, as as Kim was mentioning, my name is Tania Perez Bustos, and to answer, I think it's to answer the question, this is really good that it's happening. To answer this question, I want to make a small intervention. I think that it's really interesting that this is happening from what I'm going to do now. Let's see. The answer I'm going to give, it's supposed to be felt. Not always we understand things in the same way if we don't feel it. So I just want to see how many people in the audience can understand Spanish, and perhaps help me do an experiment. If you can just raise your hand. Oh, this is great. So we have many Spanish people who can understand Spanish. Do you people feel able to do some sort of whispering here? And I have to thank here Anita Chan for this idea. So to translate me, yes. So if you don't speak Spanish, I encourage you to sit close to someone who does. And if you don't, well, sorry, but what I'm going to say now, it's going to be said in Spanish. So la primera, sorry for Tio. I'm sorry, I'm just speaking Spanish. La primera respuesta a esa pregunta pasa por la sensación que tengo de estar aquí y sentirme como que soy una cuota. Una cuota quizás no intencional, pero una cuota potencialmente percibida así, me percibo como una cuota. Quiero responder a esa pregunta también señalando que mi contexto no es uno, sino son muchos, que mi contexto es peculiar, particular y no representativo de lo que somos, hacemos y pensamos. Retomo muy brevemente la presentación de Kim Tolberg en el primer día y de todas las personas que estaban ese día hablando de las amenazas y cómo esas amenazas, gracias Rodolfo, esas amenazas pueden ser percibidas como globales y en esa globalidad de las amenazas se nos olvidan las amenazas locales que percibimos en el sur. Unas amenazas que son complejas, inaudibles, invisibles. Y ahí traigo a colación esta imagen que está ahí. Esa imagen, si ustedes colocan nube de palabras en imágenes de Google, les va a salir esa imagen, que es particularmente algunos de los discursos, recogen los discursos en torno al proceso de paz que hubo en Colombia los últimos 4 años y que se firmó el año pasado. Ese proceso de paz es un proceso que es celebrado internacionalmente, pero profundamente cuestionado localmente. Un proceso que está en riesgo, en donde hay muchos tipos de víctimas y muchos tipos de victimarios. Hay una diversidad de guerras que tienen lugar y hablamos de guerra, de post-conflicto, de post-acuerdo y existe la necesidad de pensar cuál sería el rol de los estudios de ciencia y tecnología en ese contexto. Thank you very much. Gracias, chicas y chicos. Miren.
So I'm here representing a multitude of collaborators, 140 collaborators. So I am both attempting to take pooled responses to these questions from those collaborators and also contribute some of my own perspectives. We'll get more into the content of this work with this multitude of collaborators in just a second, but these 3 images are sort of a bare bones constellation of the problem space that our work emerged from. First, on your right is the settler colonial political context of long and ongoing climate and environmental degradation in North America. That the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, which I'm sort of representing, EDGI, came into being. So it came into being alongside both a long-term environmental problem and also a fraught environmentalism that has been leveraging some cognitive dissonance in advancing environmentalism, as also Professor Talbert invoked in the beginning of Plenary. So although this has been ongoing, with the election of Donald Trump in November, several of us began a conversation that led to the founding of this organization, anticipating an increased or at least an increased candidness about state-sanctioned environmental harm. And these 2 images relating to Administrator Pruitt, who is Donald Trump's leader of the EPA. Early on, he noted that there is going to be a new day and a new future for the environment in the United States. And that new future will probably look a lot like the pre-regulated past, albeit with a larger industrial footprint. And in this tweet, as one example of among many, Administrator Pruitt delimits the stakeholders in environmental regulation to merely those of the polluter. So all of the fence line communities, the people that breathe, which is many of us, and the people that drink water, the people that exist well beyond our national borders are all no longer stakeholders in environmental regulation. So we took seriously the rhetoric of this administration, and we began preparing in advance of the inauguration. And then the last image of the group in the boat with the red balloon is to acknowledge that many of us in this organization work in the spaces that have long been abandoned by the state, in toxic landscapes that bear a very loose relationship to the state. And so the discursive field of civic and community science is also informing a lot of the practice. In this image in particular, they're about to engage in some balloon mapping. And balloon mapping is a low-cost technique of using weather balloons, very cheap cameras, and open source software, to stitch together individual images to make maps. And this was a technique that was first pioneered during the 2010 BP oil drilling disaster, when the airspace was cordoned off, and the state and BP were collaborating to create misinformation about the extent of the oil spill. So it is in this nexus of long exposures, a new intensification, and a sort of a tradition of stepping up to fill the roles abdicated by the state that this work came into play.
Thank you. All of my slides are for the next question, so there's no slide. I'm Hugh Gustafson. Before I went to graduate school, I worked for an anti-military NGO. And then when I went to graduate school, I was looking for a way of bringing my anti-military commitments with me into graduate school and fusing them with my academic work. My two intellectual academic heroes were Michel Foucault and E.P. Thompson, the British historian, who was one of the founders of the European Nuclear Disarmament Campaign. And so in the back of my mind, I often asked myself what Foucault would do, what E.P. Thompson would do, and have tried to find a way of fusing a certain kind of political commitment with rigorous academic work and intervening as an activist on the side as well. So all of my work has been around nuclear weapons and other kinds of military issues, pretty much. Originally, I did an ethnography as an anthropologist of a nuclear weapons lab, and since 1987, I've been in sustained dialogue with nuclear weapons scientists at both the Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore National Labs, the two nuclear weapons labs in this country. And I've also been in sustained dialogue with their opponents, the anti-nuclear activists, and have been trying to find out what the anthropological and STS technique of very patiently listening to people and trying to write in a way that reframes the debate that they're stuck in, what that might yield, both academically, but also in a larger sense, politically. And I write for public audiences, and I also write for a more academic audience. Since my engagement with nuclear weapons designers began, the world has changed enormously. The Cold War ended in the early 1990s, and they lost nuclear testing, which was their key practice. American nuclear weapons scientists haven't been allowed to test a nuclear weapon since 1992, and yet they have more money now than they had during the Cold War to work on nuclear weapons R&D. So I've been tracking that long-term story, trying to understand how the vocation of a nuclear weapons scientist has shifted as they lost nuclear testing, as the larger geopolitical structure ended. In the 90s, I felt pretty satisfied and confident that the numbers of nuclear weapons were coming down, the danger of nuclear war was going down, and this liberal progress narrative sort of took over my world. And then 9/11 happened, and the US started invading Middle Eastern countries and trying to drag my discipline of anthropology in its wake, recruiting anthropologists on the ground to work in human terrain teams and so on in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so since 9/11, I've also been writing a lot about military intervention in the Middle East, why I believe Intellectually, it's a doomed project. I recently published a book that some of you may have seen on drone warfare, trying to think sort of preemptively before drones become too embedded in the military infrastructure about what kind of world drones might be creating for us. So I wrote a more publicly oriented book published by MIT Press. The question asked about the problem space that our work is situated in, and there are different ways of interpreting that phrase, but what I wanted to say about my particular problem space is that as an anthropologist, a lot of my work has involved talking in great detail and developing relationships of trust with people whose work I fundamentally oppose, right? And so that's a sort of psychologically and intellectually difficult and talked position to be in. I mean, I do feel that ethically it would not be appropriate to gain people's trust and then just trash them in my writing. That if you engage with people, they bring you into their homes, they invite you to dinner with them, to their parties and so on, you owe them a certain amount of respect in return. And so my writing about this and my public intervention, especially on nuclear weapons, has been shaped and constrained to some degree by those very intimate personal relationships I have with some of the people that I oppose. Writing the book on drone warfare was much easier and more fun because I've never met a drone operator. I did all the work from written sources. I did no interviews, no field work, and I could just really let loose. So for me, part of the problem space is shaped by whether or not I have personal relationships with the people in this techno-military infrastructure that I'm fundamentally trying to critique, but in a way that honors the integrity of the people in that infrastructure.
Thank you. Before we move on to our second query about the forms of engagement that our panelists have engaged in, I encourage each of you to think about the problem space or problem spaces in which you work that no doubt calls for engaged STS. And so our second query is, what forms of STS engagement have you been involved in, and what are some key examples?
All right, so here you have a screenshot from a website called Black to the Future, an Imagination Incubator that we began at Princeton in collaboration with my sister, colleague Moya Bailey and Ayana Jameson, who's not here. And at the heart of this initiative was an attempt to add to the analysis of socio-technical imaginaries an effort to fabricate our own, so that it's not only studying and diagnosing what is, but it's actually using the tools of a critical race STS to think about what it would mean to imagine the kinds of worlds we would want to inhabit, and not simply analyze the ones we don't. And so this entailed a workshop that included artists, writers, scholars, activists, many of whom at that time were just coming directly from their work in Ferguson, Missouri, to talk together in an intimate setting and then to hold a public symposium that was live streamed. The digital archive is on the website. And then to think about this as an ongoing initiative that's one part pedagogy, one part creativity, and scholarship. And so the pedagogy, one form it has taken is my own seminar that's also titled Black to the Future. And here I'll circle back around to pedagogy and teaching as a primary site of engagement. That we shouldn't, in many ways, limit what we think of as activism or engagement to only that which is on the front lines of protest, but sort of thinking together with our students in critical ways is really, I think, a ground zero for how I think about engagement. That said, at the symposium, a question that was posed by one of my colleagues who's not an STS scholar, in fact, provoked a whole line of inquiry for me that's now going to come in an edited volume called Captivating Technology, around race, technoscience, and the carceral imaginary. And so there's been many works in many different media that have grown out of this, that were kind of incubated here and that continue to sort of come out. And this edited volume is one of them. In addition, I've started to experiment a little bit with speculative fiction as a site of knowledge construction. And so here again, thinking really broadly about what engagement means, I think is worthwhile. In addition to this symposium, the Black to the Future Symposium, I've tried to engage in some fairly traditional kind of policy sort of consultations and deliberations around gene editing, clinical trials, and precision medicine with very questionable effect. And so I don't know the extent to which any of that has mattered, both because often STS perspectives are tokenized in those kind of forum. They come at the very, very, very end of the program when many people have gone, or in one case around gene editing during lunch when all of the chips packets were being opened and munching, and as I say, you could barely hear the ethics. So thinking for me how, okay, beyond that kind of traditional policy and sort of, ethical, add-ons that we often see, I've really enjoyed this past year engaging directly with practitioners of various sorts. Librarians have been a sort of holding down the fort in many ways in terms of both the closure of public libraries and just really understanding how knowledge production and facts are under siege, however constructed. K through 12 educators have been really important collaborators for me. I had the chance to speak at the International Society for Technology and Education, where the receptivity for STS perspectives around technology was palpable. They were so over the idea that they needed to be sold the next best gadget for their students, and were thinking very critically about the infrastructure of their classrooms and how to take things back. And so the language of STS seemed to be really useful. And I've heard about a number of projects that have grown out of that particular conversation that I was able to facilitate. And then lastly, this past year while I was on leave, I've had the chance to do some, again, fairly traditional kind of community-based teaching. I missed my own students. And so, again, working in the public library, holding a series there with a social justice organization who did all of the planning, and I just had to show up and sort of facilitate and do what I would do in my lectures. In the films that I would show to my students, we showed it in the local movie theater and had the discussions that we would have. I've had the chance again to bring so many of the ideas that we're talking about here to middle school and high school students. And I have to tell you, we were sort of asked what has been a sort of one sort of key thing that we have taken away. Middle school students get it, y'all. They get it. I feel in some ways I'm a middle school teacher in like professor drag or something. They really, especially around questions about militarism and how the sort of tensions between militarism and their own education. It was really amazing to see that go down. And then again, other organizations like Black Women for Wellness in Los Angeles, not in our town, in Princeton, where, the walls between what we're doing and what folks are doing in many other different arenas, I think they're already porous. We just need to walk through them. It's not that we need to create the connections. They're ready and waiting to be taken advantage of, and we just need to step into it. But I will say, and again, this will address more fully the third provocation around challenges, that so much of this happened while I was on leave. And so I have a lot to say about both the structural and ideological constraints around engagement, that even if people have the will to do it, the drive to do it, hope to do it, there are all kinds of things that we have to tackle together on the ideological and structural level to let us take advantage of these pores.
Okay, I think I have to go back to the picture I just missed for the last question. Back, please.
I'm sorry, what do you want?
The one with a bunch of kids occupying
This one?
shed. Yes,
The street movement?
Yes,
No, no,
yes,
no. Okay.
yes.
They're seeing this.
It's
No,
different up there.
Oh, it's different up there. Oh.
Decrease.
You have to go back.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. It's this one. Okay. Well, this is the Taiwan after the dictators are gone, and of course it takes some time. But after 2000, everything got settled. We are becoming a democracy, and people's enthusiasm about public affairs are pretty high, actually. We have millions of people protesting against the government several times, and people come out voluntarily, like in the one big picture is an urban poor community that will be torn down by the city government, and just a bunch of kids just do non-violent civil disobedience, got arrested, and so on. So this kind of thing happened, but people got very frustrated. You protest once, protest twice, and does anything change? So I come up with this idea. So please go to the one with the windmill. Okay, here's the thing. Well, I got an engineering degree, although my calculus was flunked 3 times. But anyway, so back in 2000, when we got anti-nuclear power president elected, after some back and forth, he said, no, we are not gonna stop the nuclear power plant construction. Otherwise, General Electric will be very unhappy. If General Electric is very unhappy, then the United States will be very unhappy. You know the politics. So people got frustrated. What's the use of voting? So I come up with this idea, poke around, and we have this kind of community education system called community universities, where it's a lot of freedom. You can arrange all kind of classes, and I arranged this as a kind of DIY class. Let's build a windmill ourselves. With what? With bamboo, because, well, in East Asia, bamboo is a very traditional construction method and material. And so we built this bamboo wind generator. It works, and I wrote a grant for that. It's a lot of fun listing on my grant. I want certain money to buy scrap metal. Yeah, we really go to the scrap yard and pick out things that look like that can work as a generator, and we experiment everything. So we finally got this generator up and running with minimal cost, and the main thing in this project is how to mobilize the skill of people. You see, people are educated in our developing society. A lot of people got engineering degrees, like myself, which turned out to be, well, maybe useless if you don't work as an engineer. And maybe you got a degree in electronics, which will turn out to be useless. And so, if they think this project is fun, they might go back and dig out what they were trained when they were in high school. They go to vocational school, and they got so excited about this. So this is a fun project. But the main thing is that we try to use this project to experiment what we call appropriate technology. The movement back since the 1970s, which emphasizes, everybody read Schumacher, right? Emphasizing this labor-intensive approach. Well, it doesn't quite work in Taiwan because we got everything except free time. People are overworked. So we find out this approach got a lot of problems. You got to figure out what is appropriate for this society at this particular moment. Bamboo was a bad idea too, because although we have been using bamboo for thousands of years, but nobody knows how to properly treat harvested bamboo anymore. Everybody buy that from the factory. So we got a lot of disasters. So I'm not going into that. It's a bad engineering project. It turned out we can light the lamp or something. But the thing is, if you are involved in the design, development, construction, repair of an electricity system such as this one, you got a pretty you can develop some pretty sophisticated opinion about, say, nuclear power, about the whole power system. Well, I'm not talking about political power, I'm talking about electric power. distribution, generation, whatever, and you can have an idea what that is about. And so when some technocrat tell you for their new high-tech project, you just have to shut up and listen to the expert. You can come out and say, well, you're wrong on this point, you're wrong on that point, and let's have a discussion. So this is the one fun thing I do. So next one. Another thing I do, it's not fun, it's a tragic, it's the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, they had a plant in Taiwan from 1970 to 1992, and they poisoned the underground water and they poisoned workers there. So there are thousands of workers died of gut cancer and so on. And so based on the spirit, I experiment on my windmill project. I participated in mobilizing the STS community in Taiwan and try to participate in helping the workers and their volunteer lawyers. So we organized into a pretty solid team and we keep it going. Some of our brothers and sisters have been with this campaign for 19 years. I've been with this since 2009, and we developed into all kinds of specialty. And the best thing about this this project is that it is not only mobilizing science to serve the needs of the people, to explain for social justice and so on. And the best thing is that it's all for free, because you don't do it because you got paid. You do it because you think it is right to do. And so we finally won our victory in the district court after years and years of trial in 2015. And we just finished our trial at the High Court, the appeal court. July 27 was the final debate. And the company side, they got big corporations and millions of dollars. But in the final debate, they said, you see, they said to the court that, you see, those workers are not really weak. They got so powerful people all around them. No, we are not powerful people. It's just that we run on our passion, and they run on their money. Money can dry up, passion don't. So we can fight on forever. That's the best thing that I think that's come out of it.
Thank you.
Well, I think that you've already been hearing some of the recurrent themes, and one of them is it's all about people, stupid. I'm tempted to do a little show of hands, but not about how many people speak Spanish, but I wonder if I said how many of you have had a support letter written for you by at least one other person in this room, and how many of you have written a support letter for at least one other person in this room. I wonder what fraction would not raise their hands. So that is a kind of example of what makes this a community. But, you know, having been immersed in STS since before there was even a singular understanding of what STS stands for, and there still isn't, I know that it's not when people trill off phrases like Shen Shang just did of the STS community in Taiwan, you can't help wondering what that is, or what that even is in America. I mean, you know, the single thing that I hear of most among my junior colleagues is where is the job going to come from? And professor in drag, well, I think most people keep their STS identity and go and be something else in drag, you know, a lot of the time. So a question for me sitting in that very staid building that I showed on my first slide is how could one use the pretty obdurate structures of universities to create some of the sort of software structures that would actually allow people to claim professional lives being STSers. I completely take Rupa's point about pedagogy, but Middle schoolers already have a structure where they're going to grow up and be high schoolers and eventually become real people. But I think that the life of the STS scholar is not as well charted out. Anyway, so this is a picture of the Science and Democracy Network. I'm happy to say that my inspiration from this, for this, did not come from late greats such as E.B. Thompson or Michel Foucault, but from my colleague Rob Hagendijk, who manned the barricades as a 68er in Amsterdam with much longer hair than he subsequently had. And he said to me, stop complaining about the structures of the Kennedy School and instead think about how you can create non-zero-sum space in and around. And so this network, which has grown year by year, has become a thing that I'm quite happy about in a certain sense. I mean, it is not incorporated, it doesn't have that kind of, it pays no fees. People don't pay nearly as much to come to an SDN annual meeting as they do to come to a 4S annual meeting, which may be one of its strengths. But I think that more people have actually managed to get the next step up in their academic progress through the kinds of connections they make there, and it's been a place to carry out some of what both you and Ruha have talked about, which is where do you pursue this sort of rigorous academic training at the same time that you're teaching people to become members of a community and to look out for each other as members of a community. So we had our 15th anniversary this year of an organization that has remained in some funny sense virtual, but you're all welcome to join. And then we could have two societies instead of one, all helping each other.
I'm not going to do the intervention again, so this is going to be in English. The image, I'm going to talk about that image there, and it's an interdisciplinary work that we have done with engineers, industrial designers, and anthropologists. And we started working with these people, trying to think through embroidery, the handcraft of embroidery, the making of that, and the potentials of this making to generate connections and disconnections with digital technologies. Initially, we were working with embroiderers whose livelihood depends on this work, on this labor, and then somehow the war and this relation between war and peace just became something we needed to think through when we were working with this intersection between embroidery technologies and textile technologies and digital technologies. It was like the agency of the topic was impossible to avoid, so we could not be able to continue thinking about those relations without putting them into the context of the peace agreement. So what you see here is the website of one thing we made that is basically a traveling sewing box. This is the virtual part of this traveling sewing box. It's actually a big real box made out of wood that is embroidered, and it has inside of it different types of materialities. Some of it's textile materialities, and some of the others are digital materials. So it carries one tablet that helps people to make a common repository of the process of making textile narratives of their experiences. So this traveling sewing box invites the communities that it visits to answer collectively in textile and digital forms the question of why to embroidery memory. And memory, it's understood here as a technology of remembering and documenting the atrocities of war. So this is visiting communities who have had experiences of forced disappearance, internal displacement, and murder. Communities who have what we call costureros de la memoria, which means collectives that actually gather themselves to document through textile forms what they have lived. This comes out from Chile. There are different experiences like this in different parts of Latin America, so this is not unique in our case. And so we think in this project of textile handcrafting as a technology of care that is engaged by digital, it's enhanced by digital technologies that allow collectives to document the narratives they are producing, not just as documents, as fixed documents, but as product of processes. And some of the things that the digital technologies do is that they help us to know where these communities are, but to know as well who they are, who are the people doing this embroidery, and what are the different moments of this process. Because usually textile documents are, even though they are the way they are being produced are generating spaces of healing. Usually the final textile products are only perceived as documents of what happened, but not as something that has somehow transformed the communities that have produced these things. So far, this traveling box have traveled to 5 or 6 communities of embroiderers in Colombia, and some of those, the majority of those, are victims who have been victims of the guerrilla, who have just signed the peace process agreement. So some of them have had, I'm not going to go into the atrocities they have lived, but if you are curious, you can search for the massacre of Bohaya. That's one of the communities that the box visited. And if you want to search into the site, this is a site, and if you want to look for it, it's www.costureroviajero, as is written there, .org. And so you can see there the people who are doing these things. You can see the materials they are using. You can see the pieces they are producing. You can see what they do besides just sewing and embroidering, because just is I mean, that's a lot of work. And in the following 2 weeks, the traveling sewing box, the Costurero Viajero, is visiting one of the what we call zonas veredales, which are the local places where guerrillas who just hand over their arms are gathering in the process of starting again the civil life, let's say. So it's called zonas veredales. So it's going to visit one of the zonas veredales of these guerrillas people, and it's going to be very interesting how they see the box travels with. I should have said that the box travels with textile pieces who have been produced by the communities where they answer, as I said, why to use embroidery as a way of narrating memory. So that the traveling, the box brings these things with it and helps them think through materialities on why it is important to use these particular techniques as a way of writing and of thinking about themselves and in very material terms. So it's going to be interesting to see how that is received by this new place where it is going to be visited. And so we think of this as a pedagogical tool, but also as a research tool that helps us understand with and through communities the place that materialities such as these have in the building of their livelihoods, but as well to understand other ways of comprehending knowledge as such. And so I think this is the example I wanted to bring in terms of engagement.
Thank you.
Our work at the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, or EDGI, began days after Trump was elected, and it was clear that Myron Ebel, a known climate change denier, would be leading the transition to the transition team of the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. And the conversation began amongst 12 STSers of the environment and one environmental chemist. And the question was simply, what is a humble contribution of our craft to this ongoing and large-scale regime change? And quickly, historians from Canada noted that during the Harper administration, environmental libraries were shuttered, and climate and environmental data was actually lost, burnt, found in dumpsters. This is our neighbors to the north. Other historians remembered that in 2007, George W. Bush, who has far less aggressive rhetoric against the EPA than Trump, attempted to shutter the EPA libraries. And it seemed very feasible that one of the world's largest bastions of environmental and climate data could be under threat. And so Michelle Murphy, Matt Price, and Patrick Kielty at the Technoscience Research Unit held a hackathon to see how we could archive environmental websites, and then it led also to archiving environmental and climate data sets. And this began a national and international conversation about the future of environmental and climate data stewardship. We had this map you see on the right. We had 30 events. We developed a toolkit for other communities to take these procedures and apply it themselves, along with our collaborators at the University of Pennsylvania. Over 30 events in 30 cities, aimed at putting eyes on data. You didn't have to have technical expertise. It was an invocation to participate in the stewardship of this very overlooked and taken for granted aspect of our infrastructure. And a lot of that was a little slapdash at the beginning, and from that work in archiving data, we have expanded our problematization. It's no longer a geopolitical issue relegated to the environment and the United States, but it is an issue with which how the architecture of the internet is made. We have location addressed data, which if you change the data, it's hard to detect. And it's also one linchpin can be pulled, a single server can be pulled offline and you lose a large amount of data. So we've been working with collaborators at Protocol Labs and another group called Query to advance a different hypermedia protocol, which is a decentralized architecture of the internet, which is a content addressed and a distributed architecture of the internet. So this is one small way in which we're trying to we were asking questions that were timely and perhaps a little easy at the beginning, and how can we then slowly, after we've captured the imagination and the attention of a large public, how can we shift our posture to a more critical stance to ask the questions that maybe we ask more often to each other. And this is also not a purely STS engagement. This is perhaps at the core, at the very beginning, a largely STS group, but we also have two applied physicists I see in the back that have dropped out of their PhD to work with us, and a number of other lawyers, information professionals, and nonprofit professionals that are working with us. On the bottom, you see a picture of our GitHub where code is stored. Over 100 developers across the country are working with us. And that's just one of many things that we do. Next slide, please. In addition, we have been monitoring 25,000 URLs of federal environmental websites, tracking changes to those websites. We never mentioned this explicitly at the beginning, but it's something that was aired very recently, that this is how you understand the possible rise of a proto-fascist regime, is you track the minute changes that happen quietly and without fanfare, and you do it systematically. And so what the website tracking team at EDGI has done is found changes, for example, to the way that climate change is presented to children on websites aimed explicitly to educate our youth. In addition to perhaps on the lower example, which is the erasure of the word science from the mission statement of an EPA office aimed at science and technology policy. We've also been experimenting with public scholarship in the form of 100 days, and soon on September 5th, our 200 days report This one will be on environmental justice. The first one was based upon our attempt to interview over 60 current and recently retired EPA and OSHA staff. That work was featured on the front page of the New York Times above the fold a few weeks ago, largely thanks to leadership like Chris Sellers, Lindsay Dillon, Phil Brown, and others. And Britt Paris is leading the next EJ-focused report. So we've been doing archiving in multiple ways. We've been first using a proprietary software to track changes, and now we're building our own open source software so that in the future we can all track these changes together. Public scholarship, and we've also been doing some policy recommendations in our capacity and governance working group. So these are some of our core functions, but we had also a pre-conference meeting on Tuesday where we were also trying to call into question some of the tacit things that we were implying with this work. A lot of people can read into our work a romanticism for restorative nostalgia for maybe the Obama administration. Mm-hmm. That if we could just go back a few months, that we would be in the right place. And that's even internal to the logics of the EPA, that wouldn't be right, because at the end of the Obama administration, we're at 1989 employment levels of the EPA. And then external to the ways that the EPA knows itself, there are many issues which most of us, STS scholars of the environment, work on critiquing these aspects of the state. So we had an event spearheaded by Michelle Murphy called Enacting Environmental Data Justice, bringing together a bunch of different scholars to try and think about, more in line with sort of Professor Benjamin's work on what can we do in a less reactionary posture? That what are the ways in which we can enact justice on our terms as opposed to endlessly tinkering with the technocratic apparatuses that are constantly crumbling in front of us. So.
I sense that people in the audience are eager to move into a more conversational mode, so I will try and be brief. In terms of projects of intervention and successes, I'm going to briefly touch on three things. One is writing columns. The second one is a group I helped found called the Network of Concerned Anthropologists. And then just very briefly, I'll talk about a new American Anthropological Association initiative of the last 2 or 3 months. So first of all, writing. In addition to my academic writing, I've tried to cultivate a different writing style, writing public op-eds. Occasionally I'm lucky enough to get published in the Washington Post or the LA Times. But back in 2007, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists offered me my own regular column that they agreed to publish. And since then, Sapiens, which is an online website funded by the Vanna Graham Foundation for Anthropologists, has also offered me a regular column. So I've been writing these regular columns, and at this point I've written over 70 of them, trying to bring anthropological knowledge and STS frames into writing about nuclear weapons issues and other kinds of issues of militarism and violence. So for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, for example, and that's something that's largely read by scientists and engineers, so it's a chance to bring a different perspective to that audience. I've written about things like the effects of testing hydrogen bombs in the Pacific on the Marshall Islanders, which is something that community doesn't think about very much. I've tried to bring STS ideas about the fallibility of technology to my columns to challenge what I think of as the techno-smugness of that community and make them think about the inevitability of accidents with nuclear technology. So that's what I've been doing in terms of writing. It's very hard to judge the success of writing. I do know that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists tracks how many hits the columns get, so I know that thousands of people have read the columns. If you judge success by how much you've aggravated people, to judge by the online comments, I've been very successful. I seem to hear more from my critics than my friends. So let me talk about what's up here right now. In 2006, the Pentagon announced an initiative called the Human Terrain System Program to deploy anthropologists in human terrain teams in Iraq and Afghanistan to gather intelligence on the ground that would be fed to the military to help with counterinsurgency. With 8 other anthropologists, in 2006 I founded a group called the Network of Concerned Anthropologists. In a month we got 1,000 anthropologists to sign a pledge that they would refuse to join human terrain teams and they would refuse to accept military funding in the context of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which was a pretty remarkable achievement, I thought. What you see there is a statement by the American Anthropological Association Board of Directors condemning the human terrain system. You should know that in anthro-speak, what does it say there? We disapprove. That's actually very strong language in anthropology. Can I have the next slide? Partly because of what the Network of Concerned Anthropologists was doing, the American Anthropological Association appointed a special commission called CUSIC. I won't tell you what that stands for, but it investigated the human terrain team program. And you see here their bottom line, their conclusion. They reaffirmed the executive board's condemnation of the program. Can I have the next slide? Also in 2009, the Network of Concerned Anthropologists sent a letter, which if you have good eyesight, you can read here. We sent it to President Obama, the head of the CIA, the Secretary of Defense, the senators chairing the relevant committees and so on, asking them to close down the human terrain team program. The next slide will show some of the signatories of that. So 6 of 9 former AAA presidents signed, 38 distinguished chairs signed, 45 department heads signed, 22 of the elected officials of the AAA at the time signed, 10 journal editors and so on. You get the picture. The next slide. We also published our own retort to the counterinsurgency manual, General David Petraeus' counterinsurgency manual. We published the counterinsurgency manual, which apparently has been quite widely taught, or bits of it have. Because I lived in Washington, I got sent to lobby the House Armed Services Committee on the Human Terrain System program, which was quite an interesting experience. I met with a staffer who was clearly former military. It's clear he was a huge fan of the program, but he was kind enough to give me 90 minutes. I sat in his office and told him why anthropologists found that it crossed all of our ethical lines to be in a situation where we would report on people we'd studied in ways that might end up getting them killed. And he listened patiently and then said, well, okay, well, you tell me how to run this counterinsurgency campaign. It was clear the conversation wasn't going so well. And I said, so who else could I talk to who's interested in this? And he looked at me and said, you know, none of the congressmen care about this. They're not following it. I'm your only bet. I'm the only one. I put this in the legislation. I got it funded. You got to talk me out of it, or you have no hope. Well, I'm happy to say, actually, a Republican congressman, Duncan Hunter of California, got a bill passed closing down the human terrain system program a couple of years ago. And for the amount of time that it was open, as far as I can tell, probably less than 10 anthropologists volunteered to participate in it. I mean, they had dozens of social scientists. They were almost all political scientists, although they were offering salaries of $300,000 a year to people with master's degrees in the context of a job market that was just abysmal. Probably no more than 10 anthropologists took that offer. And so I count that as a huge success for the American Anthropological Association and for the Network of Concerned Anthropologists. And just very briefly, the American Anthropological Association just this month announced a new initiative for which I'm one of the founders called the Congressional Action Network. The Vanagren Foundation funded a meeting 2 or 3 months ago, brought anthropologists from all over the country. We got trained by people who are experienced in lobbying Congress and talking to senators, trained on how you talk to those people, how you talk to their staffers. And then the American Anthropological Association staff had set up 2 days of back-to-back meetings with people on the Hill. And so we broke into little teams. We prepared our rap, and I got to meet my own senator. Most of us just met with staffers, and we practiced doing these little 2-minute raps, saying, you know, this is why you have to protect the Bears Ears Monument. This is why you have to take another look at drone warfare. This is why what Jeff Sessions wants to do with the war on drugs is a really bad idea. And so the American Anthropological Association is now getting ready to ramp this up, and at this year's meeting is offering training programs for far more members of the Anthropological Association. and their meeting will be in Washington, to encourage them to go and invade the Hill during our meeting and bring anthropological knowledge in sound